Hi, I'm Byron Johnson. We're going to go ahead and get started. I direct the Institute for Studies of Religion here at Baylor University. ISR is a university-wide research institute, and we have scholars from a number of disciplines that work there. And we're delighted today to have Juan Carlos Ochoa here to give us a lecture. But I'm not going to introduce him. I'm going to have a colleague to introduce him that worked with him for many years at the University of Texas. So I'm going to introduce Bob Woodbury, who's a research professor of sociology here at ISR, to do the introduction. Bob.
Back in 2004, when I first showed up at UT Austin with my first academic job, one of the best days of my life happened. I was sitting in my office working, and someone came walking down the hall and came in the door, and he said, "I went to anthropology and I was interested in studying religion," and they said, "Oh, we don't study religion. If you want to study religion, go to sociology." And I was just walking down the door in sociology, and your office was open. "So do you study religion?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I do." And so then he started telling me about all his he was interested in all this, doing this ethnographic work on Afro-Caribbean religions and various things like that, and telling me all these stories and things, and I thought it was very interesting and fascinating work, even though I did nothing related to that. And he said, "Would you be willing to work with me?" And I said, "Sure." So he applied and he got in. And I was involved in this big project measuring the social impact of Protestant missions around the world, and had all this data and started to get some Catholic data also. And he got involved in the project, and he happens to be able to work in Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French, Latin, and some in German. So pretty soon he's doing all these sources that I can't read, and then learning all these computer programs and languages so he can do all this programming, and then doing all these digital maps and linking through and designing the architecture for this whole project, which I'm supposedly the head of. I was. But, and so we end up working together, and he sort of helped manage the project with me, and we became really good friends. And I sent him to Rome to go to the Vatican to get some other additional sources. And he so charmed the archivists that they let him stay in the archives after everyone else got kicked out. And there was one archivist at one of the archives. He said, "Oh, we have extra copies of these books." So went back through the library and pulled out extra copies of these books from the 19th century and gave them to Juan Carlos for our project, including 2 books that are not on WorldCat. So if all the libraries in the United States, North America, all their collections are on WorldCat, so you can search them and find them for interlibrary loan. There are no copies of these books on WorldCat, and we got them for free because Juan Carlos got along well with the archivists. He went on to win the Outstanding Research Award at UT, not just for sociology, but for the whole university, and then went on to work at Pew, and he was doing global religious demography, looking at changes in religion around the world and the impact of religion around the world. On the side, he became involved in working on a project linking up Mexican censuses so that to look at poverty and changes in poverty and the conditions of indigenous communities in Mexico through time. And I think he's going to talk to you about that today. And one of the things that I thought is kind of cool is, given the sort of 5 signature initiatives of Illuminate, he covers 4 of them: Latin America, health, human flourishing, and data science, or big data. And he'll look at all of those today.
I really don't know if after Bob's presentation, I will not disappoint the audience. But first time, thank you, before anything. Thank you for being here. It's a cold day, and surely many of you and I would prefer to be in a warmer place without having to face weather and everything. Thank you for the kind invitation of the center and for all the welcoming environment that I found here. which is also an invitation to share thoughts and to put together reflections and experiences, and talk to you why I have found religion and development something interesting and appealing in my own research agenda, but I think also important in general for social scientists' approach, particularly for regions as Latin America or Africa or Asia, but also for other places. And also this will need to be developed in a longitudinal analysis. And we need to face challenges of gathering data from different times. Therefore, such a job requires tons of effort and time investment, and it's still a work in progress. And then in this context of the research, I want to also share my own context. Sometimes we as scholars try to be, of course, unbiased, but we're all in the circumstance of our own history, of our own past, of our own way of understanding scholarship. And coming from Latin America, the words religion and poverty are a mean key and a mean dimension. I think I learned in Mexico two contradictory issues, of course, in different environments. But on the one hand, for many people, religion was the worst thing that could happen in the world. For other people, it was the most wonderful thing that could happen. And that's very iconical in the circumstances of developing countries as Latin America, particularly because in Mexico, for instance, the Catholic Church is the church. There is common statements of people when someone converts to any other Christian church, they went to the other religion. You're wondering, like, what means the other? So in their imaginary, it seems that there is the religion and the other religion. And it happened to be many years in Latin America, and particularly in Mexico, that is changing and has been changing faster in the last 40 years, 50 years, but still, in the mind of many people, this is part of what has happened. Let's remember that the church was able once just publishing a statement which said that it was not immoral to have a armed, violent answer to a prolonged, evident tyranny. And then that was enough for starting the Cristiada rebellion in many states of the country. And they were defending the rights of the church. And after the struggle finished, it didn't actually end with the relationship with church and state. I would say that they started some kind of clandestine, illicit relationship. So instead of being married officially, they started living together. And then that living together and that clandestinity also led to this kind of denial of the reality of religion. I remember when working in my master's thesis in educational research, I had to devote the first 10 pages just to justify that religion. I was working on how undergrad students were understanding courses referred to religion in some universities because they wanted to give them some religious basis for their life. In other public universities because they want to question those, let's say, naive perspectives of religion. But anyways, present both in public and private universities, but they want me to justify why religion was a subject that could be object of study. Because it's part of that denial. And it's interesting that the same year of the end of the Cristero Rebellion, actually the famous Mexican painter, Diego Rivera, who was socialist and anti-clerical and materialist, paint these walls in the Mexican palace with all those reference to religious images and full of priests and full of monks. And even if portraying some of them as part of the exploitation and the operation of Mexico, acknowledging the role of some others as part of the independence of Mexico. Let's remember that among the Latin American countries, Mexico counted in their independence from Spain with the leadership of several priests who were part, who started, who led, who take to the end that independent war. Then all this presents a set of challenges when we face the issue of religion and the condition of living of the population. For instance, when we consider the states with higher migration rates to the US, traditional migration rates, they have diminished in the last years, but those are the traditional migration rates. And we start thinking how they could relate to the areas of the Cristiada. We are seeing a close spatial correlation. And we should wonder what has actually happened. Is Mexican migration correlated to that experience of lack of religious liberty in the Cristiada? Even is religious diversification of Mexican migrants correlated to their experiences of limited religious freedom? And this requires effort to gather the data, to put them together, to test the hypothesis, and to gather data through time, to see in those places what happened, because in those places became a risk for males to remain there. They say that when they surrender their guns, which were just all guns, because they never had like tons of money for that. By the way, just a small story about the Cristiada that reveals us how religion has been in every possible way of understanding it in Mexico. They did not have money, of course, for ammunition, and they needed money. So all those Catholic devout girls were able to get the ammunition from the official Mexican army. They went and devoutly offered their female favors to the soldiers in exchange of the same ammunition that was going to be used against them. So this presents just a part of those series of contradictions that we find and that require a close analysis for understanding what's going on. When seeing some statistical data, let's say on under 5 mortality in Mexico related to religious diversity, we can see that the coefficients of the indexes of religious diversity remain significant, even if we add a lot of the most important controls that would remove many other effects. And then we can observe that, particularly among indigenous population in Mexico, under 5 mortality has higher rates when there is less religious diversification, and is higher when there is a higher number of non-Catholic population, because religious diversification in Mexico means non-Catholic population. And then are also these health conditions influenced by religious diversification for a religious participation? Because then we added later some other variables that we were gathering on the presence of permanent deacons in those ecclesiastical circumscriptions. And that was also significant for removing the effect of Catholic majority. That doesn't mean that the permanent deacons were directly affecting that, but permanent deacons are a good proxy of religious participation in a Catholic diocese. Because usually that means they have also Bible groups, and they have other kind of evangelization meetings. And then we end seeing that this issue for understanding how poverty and development could have influence of religion requires longitudinal data in order to observe how influences have been shaping outcomes through time. Because in this complex relationship, Although religion and religious services could be a factor for people's life conditions, also community resources may influence where religious groups, religious providers, missionaries have been heading, and then the behaviors about religion could be result of that conditions and not otherwise. So when starting on this is like, okay, we need sociodemographic indicators, but also indicators of religious practices, of religiously inspired services, of religious commitment, and we need to gather that over time. Do these data exist? How detailed and reliable are these data? Where can we find them? How can we access them and then standardize them in a way that we can compare different sources and gather in different ways through time? And actually, all these questions, I didn't get to them by myself only, but when joining the project that Bob was referring, the project on religion and economic change, because that has been already a question that Bob has been thinking from before, from 1998, regarding the relationship of Christian missionary activity in the non-Western, North European world, and how this was shaping life conditions of people in terms of education, in terms of literacy, in terms of life expectancy. We can find many different sources for this, but we need an effort for locating them, to invest the time for gathering them, to negotiate the access to them, and then to normalize them, to put them together, to find a way of putting all this in a meaningful way. So on the sociodemographic side, we found censuses, recent data. It's already digitized by the Mexican Statistical Office, meaning from 1995 until today. They have like every 5 years some kind of usable numbers. But the census in Mexico start being printed from 1885. And all those data are not digitized. All those data are in books. And they have been asking questions on religion. They have been asking questions on religious identity. They have been asking questions, not during the whole time, but mostly before 1930, on religious marriage, turned it to civil marriage. And of course, in terms of occupations, they have asked questions about being religious leader as a professional activity. Also, the maps, the current Mexican geostatistical framework, it's a very useful set of shape files that can be used, but former data should be traced to printed references to geographical places in those actually printed census results. And we also have history of localities, a database on municipality evolution that they had online, but by several years. Currently it's not online. Luckily, we were able to negotiate. In Latin America, everything is negotiable. Therefore, we negotiated with the census office the possibility of having a private copy of the database in order to do the research, and then to gather to put together all those changes, but also other data that is not printed, a huge history of municipalities and localities from 1810 to 1980. Then we can see here the kind of current resources, digital maps, but these are the kind of materials that we were having to photocopy or digitize or get PDFs. And they had some of these materials already in PDFs, but still 7 states were not entered nor in PDFs, so they were just the hard copies, and not even complete in Mexican libraries. We had to complete with the Benson Latin American Collection in UT Austin, together with the official repository of the National Statistical Office in Mexico. And we started going through all the variables, creating tables in Excel to enter all the data, using some recognized OCR software, but revising all that, creating protocols for digitizing the data, for using the software, for revising possible errors, plausibility of data entered, and then matching tables, because if we digitize also names, it's a task undoable. We have lots more variation in names that could include signs, letters, whatever. If we just work with the numeric side of the tables, we have a limited set of characters, the digits and commas or periods at most. In religion, we also can use some part of the censuses, as I mentioned, but we also have like online database of all bishops and dioceses. There is an obsession, particularly in the Roman Catholic Church, for the authenticity of the apostolic tradition. So for a bishop to be a real bishop, it should show, let's say, his pedigree. So it should show that it was ordained by a valid bishop, ordained by a valid bishop, ordained by a valid bishop, and so forth. So if they were able to say who was ordained by St. Peter, they would put it in the data set. They don't go that far, so they didn't make the data, but they go far enough to ordinations in the 5th, 6th centuries that have been documented since then until now. Then we also got a digital version of the National Directory of the Mexican Catholic Church. We didn't have to bribe anyone for that one. We just got a very good relationship with them. And we also digitized printed versions of the Acta Sancte Sedis, and after 1985, the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, which are the documents that publish every published document by the Holy See, including all those bulls of erection of dioceses. Because each circumscription, each diocese or something like that, should be personally erected by the Pope, at least in terms of a document signed by him, in terms of creating it. Therefore, they have to document that. We were looking in all those years of publications where those bulle electionis were published, and photocopied them or photographed them to work with them. After the year 1955, we have more and more statistical data also in the Annuario Pontificio. After 1969, we have the publication of the Annuarium Statisticum Ecclesiae. We had several publications from the end of the 19th centuries until very recent of the Atlas Hierarchicus, presenting most of the dioceses. And also, we have, for numeric data, the reports presented by the bishops to the Pope every 5 years at least, in what is called the ad limina visit. So the visit that they go there and pledge fidelity and present all the report, but also present this, well, not necessarily printed. We have manuscript documents in any language that you could imagine. Of course, in that way, it would be many times the languages that I imagined that it was possible to find reports. And thank God, most of them in Latin and Italian. I never thought that Latin was going to be so friendly to me until I started working on those documents. Those are at the Vatican Secret Archives. We were able to negotiate with the Monsignor, executive director of the archive, the permission for digitizing all those data. And as far as we don't make it of public use, but just for scholars, and an agreement with the university, they agreed that we can help them with the paying of some people, some paleocryptographers, to work on that and digitize for us all those data. Also, historical old maps, and even Protestant atlases and yearbooks. And some, like for instance, there's a very difficult to find, we only have found one of those copies of a set of Protestant Latin American mission stations by the 1960s, which is an amazing detail in terms of coordinates of each one of the mission stations of Latin America. So here you saw the online resources. These are the Acta Apostolicae Sedis and Actas Antecedis, the Annuarius Pontificius, the Anuarium Statisticum, and these were like the bulle where we were locating all sections stating the creation of dioceses. This was important because it says, for instance, to the new dioceses correspond the territories from this river to this mountain, and then we gotta see how that corresponds to our current maps. When they say cities, that's great, but sometimes they just say mountains, so you gotta start looking for them. The maps, when we have them, of course, is just an issue of working, putting in the same kind of standard data for the geographic information system that INEGI, the Mexican Office of Statistics, currently uses. And these are all the possible versions of the Relaciones Diocesium. These are some photos of the secret archive. These were the scriptorium where we were working. And this is entering the data that we found in some of those relaciones. Yesterday, when I was thinking of this, I was remembering that part of the movie, The Name of the Rose, and of course of the book, when it says like everyone is just permitted to have one book at a time. They keep that custom. We had like a special permission from the cardinal in charge of that in order to have more than one copy a day. Not at the same time, but a day. Because they don't let you use more than one copy at a time. And then we establish collaboration agreements with different instances. This is one with the Mexican Episcopal Commission of Social Pastoral for sharing data. We also, as I said, access Protestant mission stations. And then from there, we created digital maps of current civil and ecclesiastical borders. We were following back all those civil and papal decrees back through time. We were looking for all those changes in a way that we are able at the end to display in several layers of data borders on a single digital map. They display what we call the maximum historically consistent geographic units, which are the minimum unit of aggregation that we use. What this means is that we first overlay all the different, we have to digitize everything and to put it in the same geostatistical system in order to match them together. And to those geographic units, we attach any other information because it's actually the geographic area, the one that is going to let us make all the comparisons through time. Then we attach to those units all the available data. In this case, for instance, the higher part, it's the materials from the Catholic Hierarchy.org, which has all the diocese evolution, and we use it as a quality control set to check against any possible changes that we find. This is a document, an Excel document, digitizing several years of the Annuario Pontificio with number of priests or number of nuns or number of hospitals or schools that we find in each one of the circumscriptions. The other Excel document is a extract of the census data, and then all of them are attached to each one of the geographic units. We are developing this and being able to display the changes, sometimes dividing the polygons, sometimes it's lots easier when you just divide the dioceses in two and you say, well, when going back, you just merge the two polygons. The problem is when the new diocese takes parts from two other dioceses in the past, then you have to retrace the hypothetical borders. And at least we did this considering that we could have bias on territory, but not on population, because we have the complete list of localities for each one of the municipalities at that time from the Mexican Census Data. Therefore, we are able to locate those main localities, trace new borders, using tracing the polygons, so tracing the equal distances from each one of the populated points to trace a hypothetical boundary. So those borders are not probably real borders in terms of administrative units, but are not biased in terms of the population encompassed in those areas. And then we are able to display changes through time. We have also located each one of the over 4,000 parishes in Mexico in each one of the places that they have been reported in the National Directory. And with all this together, the squares are our units of information from raster data to add, say, climatic data, like swamp, rain, precipitation, other factors that could be affecting temperature, that could be affecting the places where religious services were provided at those times. Actually, our version of the maps became the official version used by the Mexican Conference of Bishops, because they were more accurate than their former versions, of course. And this has been where we are. So this has been a time of walking, trying to reach the data. Of course, one of the most interesting tasks that we have in front of us is the digitization of the secret archive, because there is no general publication on that at all in the world. Some countries could have some of those documents published or something like that for a small region, but not even for a whole country. And then being able to do that, because they also, what they say, we said we're interested in Latin America and Africa and Asia. They said we cannot do something for just one region. We said, okay, we paid the digitization for the whole world. You just give us the permission for digitize that. Okay, no problem. Because then you're not marginalizing any area in the world. And that's one of the pending issues. We're 75% in the issue of digitizing the Mexican census data. So we have entered like roughly 3/4 of the information. We have to match them. We have to still establish all the linking to the territorial units. And we hope to be able to keep working on this, because we think it's worth to understand that relationship between those religious variables we consider important, but also health outcomes and mortality outcomes and poverty outcomes that can only be understood if we see them in a longitudinal perspective. And we think our data will not be only useful for those interested in religion, because once we have a census data linked historically for over 130 years, it will be possible for other scholars to use other variables attached to those units and do some other kinds of research that will be, we hope, very useful for a better understanding of this development in Mexico. So this is where we are. Thank you very much for this time, and I will gladly appreciate any comments or questions that you have. Yes.
Have you come to some conclusions already?
In terms of historical development that we can get in a conclusion, no, because we would need to have at least, the problem is that it's not just cleaning one variable. We got to clean areas. So the variables are the less complicated issue. The complicated issue is having all the areas defined over the 130 years. Then when we get all the areas defined, we can use every information we have to attach there. Because I remember sometimes they tell me, why don't you take just one of the variables and link? It's the same work for linking one variable than for linking all the census data. The problem is not in making consistent, for instance, literacy. Okay, at the end of the 19th century, they were using illiteracy over 25, and then they switched to illiteracy over 16, and then they switched to illiteracy over 12, I think is the current. That's not a problem, because we have many other census variables that could help us to adjust those numbers. The problem is that for making them comparable, we have to have the geographic units consistent. Then we can have some issues in terms of broader units, but those wouldn't be giving us the right idea of what's going on, because what's going on happens at the lower level. In terms of cross-sectional data, we know that, for instance, according to the 2010 census in Mexico, the Catholic Church is not located in the poorest area, considering a multi-dimensional poverty measurement, but except in terms of education. For all other variables, proxies for health, for living conditions, for access to, for sanity, access to running water, they are not in the poorest areas. And we were using different ways of aggregating and making sense of the data. And the only one that makes sense is in terms of lower education. But that's only a snapshot in time. That does not tell us exactly what had happened in the past, and if the areas where they were in the past have been somehow influenciated by that presence, and then we can see now the effects of that. One of the advantages we have, at least in terms of the Catholic data, is that in contrast with the US circumstance, where Catholic dioceses are closing parishes, that usually, for saying usually, I would say that never happens in Mexico. They are also going on the division. And I don't think that they have enough people for attending everything. It's just that they don't think that it's possible to close it. It's a more French, Spanish conception of law. When you create an entity, as those are legal entities, it's very complicated in French law to say like, and now it disappeared. Yeah, they prefer to keep them existent in a kind of latency than to eliminate them. Thank you.
So Juan Carlos, how far along are you in this data collection process?
In terms of data collection, I would say, like, for instance, depending on the sources, Atlas Hierarchicus is all of them digitized for the matters that we use them. The Acta Apostolicae Sedis needs to be set on, like, updated after the 2005 publications, because that's when I stopped digitizing all the creation of circumscriptions, and also looking for difficult places, because our first procedure was looking in both the thematic indexes and the date indexes of the publications of documents from the Pope. But sometimes you don't find them directly. What happened? Probably a typo got misclassified, and it was not useful to read all the thousands of pages just for looking above. So when we find a difficulty, which would be less than 3% of the circumscriptions for Latin America since 1900 until today, all those cases, we gotta look for them with more detail, establishing time frames that could be plausible for the erection to have the exact limits. We have from the CatholicHierarchy.org the dates, but we need the document because that's where we find the exact limits. Now, if we don't find at that publication for some other reason, someone forgot to send the paper, L'Osservatore Romano, which is the daily publication of the Holy See, is less likely to have missed in their daily publication one of those documents. So next step would be going to the archives who have the L'Osservatore Romano to read through those documents and find the erection bull. So that would be in terms of just erection. In terms of statistical data on number of priests, number of schools, number of hospitals, beds in hospitals, etc., those kind of social services, from 1960 until today, the Annuario Pontificio gives us a very good view. Probably we have everything already entered until 2010 as well. Now we have to update from there, and we have to also find the best sources before that. Actually, we are of the people that are waiting for the death of the Pope. Because you know that the secrecy in the archive remains by 5 pontificates. And for some reason, they consider that Benedictus XVI is still alive, legally, even if he's not a pope. So since legally he's still alive, although not being a pope, they cannot release the data of the last pontificate after him. It's a small gap just to get to the 1950-something, so before the pontificate of Pius XII. But if something happened to him, God, I don't know how to say it, God forbids it or God permits it, but however, that would be very, very convenient in terms of data. No, it's funny because in the Vatican they let you have. The issue is that it's an issue of moral respect of the documents. Yeah. They give you all the documents, the allowed or not allowed to read. Just the not allowed to read are sealed with a kind of a cord tying together all those pages. So you're not supposed to untie it. And you don't try it in a small scriptorium of that one, where they can see you when you untie it. It's not as easy as bribing someone in Mexico. Then that's actually the problem. Those documents which exist and are there for now are not available until the next release of data from the Vatican. Yes?
How do you consider the impact of the non-Catholic Church in some of these areas of economic change?
I think it's a huge impact in the recent years, mostly in the recent years, because we can see a higher number of conversions. And then we have from 1970 to today, for instance, in Guatemala, a turn of the population majority in Latin America. In some states of Mexico happened the same than in Guatemala. But it requires also a closer observation of what's really happening. We have a problem in the way of stating for some Pentecostal and evangelical churches what church do they belong. A way of presenting themselves both in urban and rural areas and indigenous areas in Mexico. It's saying, this is not a church. This is a way of following Jesus. And then when they go in the census and ask them, what religion are you? They say, I have no religion. I am a follower of Jesus. I have no religion. But for the census, they end as unaffiliated. So the assumption that we should do is that at least half of the unaffiliated in Mexico are actually evangelicals or Pentecostals. And then we should consider those areas as part of that. But since we have them as unaffiliated, that bias our estimation, both of religious diversity and of the presence of Protestant churches. That's why it's that important to have also the digitization of the most current localities of the churches. For that, there are other civil sources, like the National Register of Religious Associations in Mexico. But that one is even more misleading. Because, for instance, in a Catholic diocese, the bishop can register himself and all the churches under his authority. And then a parish could decide that they are a religious association, and they register themselves. And then a religious community, as Jesuits or Franciscans, could decide that they are also a religious association, and they also register. But this doesn't always happen. So it's impossible to see when we have duplications or triplications. That I have a priest friend of mine who appears 4 times in the national roster of Christian ministers, because he was registered by the diocese, by the community, by the dean, and by the parish. And then those actual registers make very difficult to follow. We could hypothesize that many non-Catholic groups wouldn't have any reason for being registered more than once. The problem is that you got to be familiar with the way of registering. We are the community of the Holy Spirit in this address, under this leadership. Is that the parish of the Holy Spirit? Or is that an evangelical group, the Holy Spirit? Or what exactly they are? So the best way is to have at least more reliable data on what were considered Protestant mission stations until before the 70s, and then to be able to use them in the longitudinal analysis until we find more effective ways of locating the non-Catholic activity in each one of the locations. So actually the worst problem is following. Before the 60s, we have a wonderful quality on Protestant data, wonderful. But after that, since we don't have a unified version of presenting the data, we don't have such a quality. And then it's very difficult to trace exactly the most, the fast-growing period of Pentecostals.
What was the source of that before 60?
But we have several sources, like several missionary atlases that they were trying to keep like an organized work around the world.
So something changed about that time in the record keeping.
I think, on the one hand, for Latin America, things became lots more complicated for keeping track of all that. Also, I think that the way of the chance of reproduction of ministry became more unstable. There are Pentecostal churches where a pastor can become a pastor in a week. There are other churches that require some seminary training for some longer. How do you keep track of all those pastors that within a week the Holy Spirit called them to create another community, but didn't call them to be registered in the national roster? We should demand the Holy Spirit to do both and avoid that, together with the favor of the Pope.
So this is really fascinating what you're saying about the unaffiliated showing up. You know, we have this issue of the nuns here in the U.S., and some of us think that that category also is very misleading, that there are people that are highly religious that are being coded as nuns. You're saying that in Latin America this is much more of a problem.
Yes.
So this may be an unfair question, but do you think there are other parts of the world where we would find similar problems where people are being coded as unaffiliated when in fact they are very religious?
Yes.
Pentecostal, evangelical.
I think so. In Pew, they avoid to always put numbers that could be contradictory. And I cannot say anything. What we did when I was part of that, I just invite you to download the sets, which are public, on surveys, and to look on those people answering that they are affiliated. But later in the questionnaire, they show interest in religious practices. Because that's possible to be located in those data sets. And that happens very often in surveys. Yeah, that's, I mean, people could understand in many ways, and particularly because current both Christian and Muslim groups tend towards being less in an institutional hard identity. And then they could end being a little more, let's say, in a diffuse identity for that declaration question.
Dr. Esparza, Ochoa, I wonder if you would comment on following the same line of thought that colleagues have mentioned. I'm not thinking so much about the statistics. I'm thinking about what you have described so well as the character of people affiliating, especially in Latin America and Africa, to religion. vis-a-vis the way in which academia tries to identify affiliation. Is there something inherent about the Latin American religion imagination that will always resist any way of pinning down a group or a community to a particular group? Is there something in this thing that you so well described, this fluidity? Is there something about it that is intrinsic to global Christianity, to the global South?
Or I would say it's common to any, probably to any area where different religious practices have been living together and still in the struggle for supremacy or for diversity. Like for instance, when we gain the term pagan into modern languages, it was because in the early Roman Empire, after the conversion of Constantine to Christianity, there were still people in the small towns, in Latin pagus, who were still not belonging to the metropolitan churches. So those people living in the pagus, say country people in Latin paganus, became those not being Christian. I think that has happened, for instance, in the Caribbean, the multiple identities with this evident and studied syncretization. But I think it goes broader than that area. The Brazilian census tried to add the possibility of having double or triple religious affiliation. It just gave us a headache in terms of numbers. Yeah, because the total population adds to 120% or something like that. Because you have higher percentages of everything. They don't match to 100%. And you cannot round, like, it's like when my daughter was close to me when I've been studying religion, she said, well, I am half Christian, half Muslim, and half Jewish. And I still think how she can be one and half herself, but for her it's very logical to be half each one of those. But for many people in everyday life, it's coherent to be. Remember when working in Cuba as a missionary, people saying, yeah, I'm Catholic because I believe in Santa Barbara, who is Shango. Why not? So for them, in that world, there is no contradiction in those two statements. In Mexico happened when the revolution, I was discussing with some scholars a couple of days ago, the issue of calling the Mexican 1910 revolution as an anti-clerical revolution. Anti-clerical, yeah. I mean, one of them was against the church. And some of them were against the clerus and praying to the Virgin of Guadalupe and the Padrecito to protect them. So those are categories that were completely far from their understanding. And then we cannot just impose those categories. We should understand the limitations, particularly of quantitative approaches. They are useful, but they are not everything. Someone was telling me also in this conversation that statistics are a little bit as the Speedo shorts. They show many things, but still cover the most important. Then our research cannot be just like monolithic. We need always multicultural and transdisciplinary approaches for understanding it. That doesn't mean are not useful. And I am convinced that we need to be honest and we try to do our best effort to use, like for instance, for understanding the issues of undefined mortality, I had to use like Monte Carlo simulation for the number of communities having majority of or not of religious population. And for my dissertation on the service in poor areas, I had to use an adjuster standard error that I had to reprogram in R in order to get the models to run because I was having different units. And then for not biasing, the E I was able to use another n and then overimpose the n and change the internal algorithm of the negative binomial and all that stuff. And those are very complicated issues. And we gotta be honest on not overinflating our results. That doesn't mean we cannot be honest and humble in the kind of truth we are reaching. We find the truth in one way, but we still get to use some other approaches for other ways. And for instance, I am convinced that in terms of released identity, qualitative approaches are always necessary to understand what's going on. In Eastern Mexico, for instance, it's very common to use, particularly in the US, I have heard that many times more often than in Mexico, like those cultural Catholics are not really Catholics. And then we have one of these cultural Catholics whose daughter decided to be Protestant, and he never let her daughter enter again the house. Is that a strong identity or not? I think that is pretty strong. At least for the girl, should have it sound strong enough. But for some scholars, if they don't go to Mass, if they don't confess, if they don't this and that, they're not real Catholics. Who say who's real Catholic? In the Mexican youth survey, that's something that Bob and I discuss a lot, we have a 3% of Protestant young people who believe in the Virgin of Guadalupe. Are they less Protestant? I am not sure about that. I mean, they are building up their identity in different ways, in different contexts. And in this case, our statistical data help us to understand what's the problem there and what we can say about that. In the most recent survey that the Mexican scholars organized on religious practices and beliefs in Mexico, one of the anthropologists said, because he was asked to work on indigenous identity. We have two ways traditionally in Latin America to define indigenous population. One is you speak an indigenous language. The other is you self-identify as indigenous. None of them are real ways of identifying an indigenous. Because, for instance, in Peru, there is a university that a Franciscan bishop opened. The requirement was speaking an indigenous language. And I found 2 or 3 very well-positioned, socially well-positioned girls who had learned an indigenous language to enter the university. It was a lot cheaper to speak Achenica than to pay a university. And they did it. So they fulfilled the requirement. They were in an indigenous university. Also, there are people who say, I am indigenous. Now that we're like trying to recover all the ancestry, many people could say, like, yeah, I know that my grandfather came from an ethnic group, and I know that for sure. Am I indigenous? Yes and no. So it depends on the way. Of course, I don't feel that I am not indigenous, not have anything to do with it. But I would consider fair to classify myself as indigenous unless it's in a survey for getting some help or something like that. But then, as a girl answer also here from the Chicano population, I only say I am Hispanic when I know it comes a grant or some kind of funding. Hispanic is a category created. I'm not Hispanic. I'm Mexican. I learned that I was Hispanic, and most Mexican population learned. They also were Hispanic when they came to the US. In Mexico, Hispanic is almost offensive because Spaniards are the worst part. I mean, the jokes are against the Spaniards. I remember a Spanish nun that she was always like bothered by their sisters in the community. You and your grandparents came and killed. Your grandfathers. And then one day she got mad and said, look, my grandparents stay in Spain. That's why I'm Spanish. Your grandparents came and killed. That's why you are mestizos. So those kind of issues. But imagine that's a very deep issue in Mexico, like hating the Spanish because those are the bad people. But here they come and suddenly become Spanish population. Those are the way categories are proposing. So I think we have to face those challenges without leaving aside the possibilities that gives us the self-identification, because self-identification means something as well. And as far as we know that it was not biased, it has a meaning. As far as we know that there was not an imposition, there has a meaning.
That may be a good place for us to stop. Would you join me in thanking Juan Carlos for a great lecture?
Thank you very much.